Welcome to Aurora, Colorado, a small town where secrets linger beneath the surface and lives unravel in the most unexpected ways. Today, we begin the journey of Ellie Thompson, a 9-year-old girl whose innocence collides with a world of betrayal, tragedy, and hidden truths. Her story will leave you questioning the boundaries of love, justice, and survival. Stay with us, subscribe, and prepare for a tale that will touch your heart and ignite your fury. The night was heavy with the smell of rain as Ellie Thompson sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of her small bedroom. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves around her face as she carefully assembled a puzzle, its image a bright and cheerful zoo scene. But tonight, there was no joy in her heart. Her fingers hesitated as she placed a piece, her mind consumed by questions she dared not ask aloud. Her father, Richard Thompson, a tall man with sharp features and an even sharper temper, was stomping through the house downstairs. His heavy footsteps reverberated through the old, creaky walls. Ellie flinched at every sound, knowing that one wrong move could summon his anger. It had been months since her mother, Laura, had fallen into a coma. She remembered the day like it was yesterday, her mother collapsing in the kitchen, clutching her chest as Ellie screamed for help. Now, the once vibrant woman lay silent and still in a hospital bed, leaving Ellie alone with Richard, whose mood had grown darker with each passing day. "Ellie!" Richard's voice bellowed up the stairs, making her jump. "Get down here!" She quickly pushed the puzzle aside, her small hands trembling. Descending the narrow staircase, she saw him standing by the door to the basement, his face shadowed in the dim light of the single overhead bulb. His piercing blue eyes bore into her. "Why were you asking about your mother earlier?" he snapped, his voice laced with irritation. Ellie hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. "I miss her." "Well, stop asking. You're not helping anyone by bringing it up," he barked, his tone cold. "But Enough," he roared, slamming his hand against the wall. Ellie recoiled, fear flooding her chest. "You want to keep sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? Fine. Let's see how curious you are after this." Before Ellie could react, Richard grabbed her arm roughly and dragged her toward the basement door. She struggled, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, please," she begged. "I didn't mean to make you mad." "I'm sorry." He didn't answer. The door creaked open, revealing the dark void below. The smell of damp concrete and mildew hit her like a wave. Richard shoved her inside, and she stumbled, catching herself on the splintered wooden railing. "You can stay down here and think about what you've done," he said, his voice emotionless. Then, with a deafening slam, the door shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. Ellie stood frozen, her heart pounding. The faint glow of a single bulb dangling from the ceiling illuminated the bare, cold room. But something wasn't right. She heard a sound, soft at first, then louder. A low, guttural growl. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned toward the corner of the basement. 2 golden eyes glowed in the shadows, staring at her with an intensity that made her legs feel like jelly. It was a lion. The animal was massive, even as it lay chained to the wall. Its mane was thick and matted, and its ribs protruded slightly beneath its golden fur. It growled again, the sound rumbling through the confined space like thunder. Ellie's knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The lion didn't move, its eyes locked on hers. Minutes felt like hours as they stared at each other. Slowly, Ellie realized something. If the lion wanted to attack her, it would have already. It seemed restrained, its gaze more curious than threatening. Her fear mingled with confusion. Why was a lion in their basement? How did it get there? The door above creaked open, and Richard's shadow loomed at the top of the stairs. He descended, carrying a metal bowl. The lion growled louder this time, pulling against its chains as Richard approached. "Shut up," Richard muttered, slamming the bowl on the floor in front of the lion. The animal bared its teeth, but Richard ignored it, turning to glare at Ellie. "Now you know what happens when you don't listen," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Stay here. Maybe you'll learn something." He stormed back up the stairs, slamming the door behind him once more. Ellie's chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. The lion sniffed the bowl, its movements slow and deliberate. It glanced at her briefly before returning to its meal. For the first time, Ellie allowed herself to whisper. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Of course, the lion didn't answer, but its eyes met hers again, and something in their depths made her feel less alone. The hours passed like an eternity. Ellie stayed in her corner, watching the lion cautiously. Despite her fear, she couldn't shake the feeling that the animal was just as much a prisoner as she was. When Richard finally opened the door to let her out, she hesitated, glancing back at the lion. "Move it," he barked, grabbing her arm and hauling her upstairs. He didn't say another word as he shoved her toward her room and locked the door behind her. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Why would her father keep a lion? Was it dangerous? And most importantly, what had happened to the kind man he used to be before her mother's illness? She didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. There were more secrets in that house than she could ever have imagined, and somehow, she was determined to uncover them. The morning sun cast a pale light over the quiet neighborhood of Aurora. Ellie lay awake in her small bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The events of the previous night played in her mind like a haunting melody. The lion's golden eyes, Richard's cold rage, the damp air of the basement. None of it felt real, yet the soreness in her limbs and the fear in her chest told her otherwise. Downstairs, the clattering of dishes echoed through the thin walls. Ellie's stomach growled, but the thought of facing her father made her hesitate. She hadn't forgotten the cruelty in his voice, the way he had thrown her into the basement without a second thought. A shiver ran down her spine. "Ellie!" Richard's voice thundered up the stairs. "Get down here!" Taking a deep breath, Ellie swung her legs over the side of the bed and slipped into her worn sneakers. She padded down the stairs, her fingers grazing the railing for balance. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast, and Richard stood by the counter, his arms crossed. "Sit," he ordered, nodding toward the table. Ellie obeyed, her eyes flicking nervously to the plate of dry eggs and toast in front of her. Richard leaned against the counter, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you know why I'm hard on you?" he asked suddenly, his voice unusually calm. Ellie shook her head, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. "Because the world isn't kind," he said, his tone firm. "It chews people up and spits them out, especially weaklings. You need to toughen up, Ellie." Her lips trembled, but she bit them to keep from crying. She didn't feel tough. She felt small, scared, and hopelessly out of her depth. "Eat," he commanded, turning away to pour himself a cup of coffee. "I have business to take care of today. Stay out of the basement." The mention of the basement made her chest tighten. The lion's image flashed in her mind again, and she couldn't suppress the question that escaped her lips. "Why is there a lion down there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. Slowly, he turned to face her, his blue eyes narrowing. "Don't ask questions about things you don't understand," he said coldly. "You hear me?" Ellie nodded quickly, her appetite vanishing. Richard grabbed his jacket and stormed out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. The house fell silent, save for the ticking of the old wall clock. Ellie spent the next few hours pacing the living room, her thoughts consumed by the lion. She felt a strange pull to return to the basement, even though the idea terrified her. The animal hadn't hurt her last night. If anything, it seemed as trapped and miserable as she was. Making sure Richard was gone, Ellie tiptoed to the basement door. Her heart pounded as she turned the knob and descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls. When she reached the bottom, she saw the lion lying in its corner, its chain rattling softly as it shifted. It lifted its head at her approach, its golden eyes locking onto hers. Ellie swallowed her fear and stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. "Hi," she said softly, her voice shaking. I brought something." She pulled a slice of bread from her pocket, her hands trembling as she extended it toward the lion. The animal sniffed the air but didn't move. Taking a deep breath, Ellie placed the bread on the floor and stepped back. The lion hesitated, then leaned forward and nibbled at the offering. A flicker of relief warmed her chest. "You're not so scary, are you?" she whispered. For a moment, the lion paused, its gaze softening. Ellie sat down on the cold floor, her fear giving way to curiosity. She studied the animal's movements, the way it seemed cautious but not aggressive. It wasn't the monster Richard made it out to be. It was just a creature in chains, like her. As she sat there, Ellie noticed something glinting near the lion's chain. Crawling closer, she saw a brass tag attached to the metal collar around its neck. The words were faded but still legible. Balthazar, property of Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. A sanctuary? Ellie's mind raced. The lion wasn't meant to be here. It belonged somewhere safe, somewhere far away from this cold, dark basement. Footsteps echoed above, startling her. Ellie's heart leapt as she scrambled to her feet. She had been so lost in thought that she hadn't heard Richard return. Panicked, she bolted up the stairs, closing the door quietly behind her. She pressed her ear against it, listening. "Who's there?" Richard's voice boomed from the living room. Ellie froze, her breath caught in her throat. She heard another voice, deeper, unfamiliar. "A man." "Relax, Thompson," the stranger said, his tone low and measured. "I'm here about the shipment." Ellie crept toward the edge of the staircase, peeking around the corner. Richard stood by the window, his arms crossed defensively. The man facing him was tall and broad, with a leather jacket and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "I told you it's not ready yet," Richard snapped. "Not what I heard," the man replied, exhaling a puff of smoke. "Word is you've got something big. Something that could fetch a nice price." Ellie's stomach churned. Were they talking about the lion? She clutched the railing, her knuckles white. "I don't need you poking around," Richard said, his voice rising. "You'll get your cut when I say so." The man smirked, flicking ash onto the carpet. "Careful, Thompson. You wouldn't want anyone to find out what you're hiding down there." Richard grabbed the man by the collar, his face inches from his. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "Maybe not," the man said, shrugging off Richard's grip. "But others might." Without another word, the stranger turned and walked out the door, leaving Richard seething. Ellie ducked back, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't stay silent anymore. Whatever Richard was involved in, it wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Later that night, Ellie lay awake in her bed, staring at the puzzle she hadn't finished. Her mind buzzed with fear and uncertainty. She thought of the lion of the sanctuary mentioned on its tag. Somehow she had to find a way to help it. But how could a 9-year-old girl go up against a man like Richard? A noise outside her window made her sit up. Peeking through the curtain, she saw a car idling at the curb. The man from earlier was inside, watching the house. Ellie's heart sank. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The next morning, the world outside seemed normal enough. Children rode their bikes along the quiet streets, the occasional dog barked, and the mailman made his rounds. Yet, for Ellie Thompson, nothing felt normal. Her home was a prison, and her father, Richard, its cruel warden. Her mind replayed the scene from last night. The stranger in the leather jacket, his ominous warning, and the way Richard had clenched his fists in barely contained fury. Ellie sat at the small kitchen table, her untouched bowl of cereal growing soggy. Across the room, Richard shuffled through a pile of papers, muttering to himself. His face was tight, the lines around his mouth deepening as he frowned. "Eat," he snapped without looking up. Ellie obeyed, mechanically lifting the spoon to her mouth. She could feel his mood simmering like a storm cloud ready to burst. She didn't dare ask about the man from last night or the lion. Her father's temper was a beast she had no intention of provoking. As the hours dragged on, Richard left the house, slamming the door behind him. Ellie watched from the window as his car sped off down the street. The moment he was gone, she sprang into action. Her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She had to understand what was happening. Her first thought was to return to the basement, but the memory of Richard's warnings made her hesitate. Instead, she went to his office, a cluttered space crammed with old books, loose papers, and the lingering smell of cigar smoke. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding. The desk was a mess. Documents piled haphazardly, pens scattered, and a small locked drawer catching her attention. Ellie tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she rifled through the papers on top. Most were incomprehensible to her. Figures, invoices, and letters, but one stood out. It was a crumpled flyer for the Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, the name matching the tag on the lion's collar. The flyer advertised a safe haven for exotic animals rescued from illegal captivity. Ellie's eyes widened as she read the words. Did the lion belong there? And why would Richard take it from a place meant to protect it? Her investigation was cut short by the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Panic surged through her. Ellie shoved the flyer into her pocket and scrambled to tidy the desk. As Richard's heavy footsteps approached the front door, she slipped out of the office, her heart racing. Richard entered with an armful of groceries and a sour look on his face. He set the bags down and glanced at her suspiciously. "What you been doing?" he asked. "Nothing," Ellie replied quickly, her voice higher than she intended. Richard's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Instead, he barked orders for her to help put away the groceries. Ellie moved quickly, avoiding his gaze. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was off. That evening, Ellie sat in her room with the flyer spread out before her. She traced the picture of a lion with her finger, imagining the one in the basement roaming free in a sanctuary. She had to know more. But how? An idea struck her. She dug through her school bag and pulled out her notebook. On the last page, she scribbled a letter. To the Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. "My name is Ellie, and I need your help. There's a lion in my basement. I think it belongs to you." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. After a moment, she added, "I don't know how to make him safe, but I think he's in danger. Please help me." Ellie folded the note and stuffed it into an envelope. She didn't know if it would reach anyone, but it was worth a try. The thought of the lion suffering in chains while she did nothing was unbearable. The next day, Ellie waited until Richard left for one of his mysterious meetings. She tucked the envelope into her jacket and walked to the nearest mailbox, her heart hammering with every step. The crisp morning air bit at her cheeks as she approached the blue metal box. She hesitated, glancing around nervously, before slipping the letter inside. As the envelope disappeared, a rush of relief washed over her. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, Ellie felt a flicker of hope. That hope was short-lived. When Ellie returned home, she found Richard pacing the living room, his face dark with anger. The sight of him stopped her in her tracks. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I went for a walk," Ellie stammered, avoiding his gaze. "Don't lie to me," Richard roared, crossing the room in 2 swift strides. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. "What were you doing out there?" "I wasn't doing anything," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. Richard's gaze bore into her, searching for the truth. Finally, he released her with a grunt of disgust. "Go to your room, and stay there." Ellie fled upstairs, her body shaking. She slammed the door behind her and collapsed onto the bed. Her arm throbbed where he had grabbed her, but it was the sting of fear and helplessness that hurt the most. She buried her face in her pillow, muffling her sobs. For a brief moment, she had believed she could make a difference. Now she wasn't so sure. That night, Ellie was startled awake by a noise outside her window. She sat up, her heart racing. Through the glass, she saw a figure standing by the curb, the same man from before, the one who had argued with Richard. He was smoking a cigarette, his face partially obscured by the glow of the streetlight. Ellie crept to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched him. Why was he here? Was he watching the house or her? The man glanced up suddenly, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Ellie gasped and stumbled back, her pulse pounding in her ears. When she peeked again, he was gone. The next morning, Richard was in an even fouler mood. He barked orders at Ellie, slammed cupboards, and muttered under his breath. She avoided him as best she could, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. By midday, Richard grabbed his keys and stormed out, muttering something about taking care of things. As the sound of his car faded, Ellie exhaled a shaky breath. She knew she couldn't keep living like this. Trapped, afraid, and powerless. The letter to the sanctuary was a step, but it wasn't enough. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Ellie made her way to the basement. The lion was there, its golden eyes watching her intently. She crouched a safe distance away, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I'm going to help you," she said softly. "I promise." The lion tilted its head, as if it understood. Ellie didn't know how she would keep that promise, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't give up, no matter how dangerous the path ahead might be. Ellie spent the rest of the day cloistered in her room, her thoughts swirling with fear and determination. Her gaze constantly darted toward the window, half expecting the strange man to appear again. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made her flinch. But when the night came, she knew she couldn't just wait for answers to come to her. The house was quiet. Richard hadn't returned yet, and the eerie stillness only heightened Ellie's anxiety. Taking a deep breath, she pulled on her jacket and tiptoed downstairs. If the stranger had come back, she had to find out why. The neighborhood was dark and silent, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Ellie's sneakers crunched softly against the gravel as she walked toward the curb where the man had stood the night before. She scanned the empty street, her heart pounding. "Looking for me?" The voice startled her, low and gravelly, coming from the alley between two houses. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, the man stepped into the light, his leather jacket gleaming faintly. He flicked a cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "What are you doing out here, kid?" he asked, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her. Ellie didn't answer right away. She couldn't decide if he was dangerous or just mysterious. Either way, the fact that he seemed connected to Richard and the lion drove her to speak. "Why are you watching my house?" she demanded, her voice shaky but firm. The man raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Smart kid," he said, crossing his arms. "Name's Grant. I work with your dad. Or at least I used to." Ellie's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Grant leaned against the lamppost, his expression darkening. "Let's just say your old man's in some deep trouble, and he's dragging you right into the middle of it." Ellie's mouth went dry. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting Richard to appear out of nowhere. "What kind of trouble?" she whispered. Grant hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You don't need to know all the details, kid. Just stay out of the basement, and don't go digging where you shouldn't." His words sent a chill down her spine. "What's going to happen to the lion?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grant's smirk vanished. He straightened, his gaze growing colder. "That thing isn't your problem. It's dangerous, and your dad's not the kind of guy who cares about what happens to it or you." Ellie's chest tightened, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "It's not dangerous. It's chained up, scared. And enough!" Grant snapped, his voice cutting through the night. He took a step closer, towering over her. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid. The world doesn't care about scared animals or scared little girls. It chews you up and spits you out. Stay out of it before you get hurt." Ellie took a step back, her fists clenched at her sides. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Someone has to care." "I do." For a moment, Grant looked almost surprised. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he muttered. "But guts won't save you from what's coming." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ellie alone under the flickering streetlight. Back in her room, Ellie sat on the edge of her bed, her hands gripping the folded flyer from the Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary. Her conversation with Grant had only deepened her resolve. She couldn't let Richard or anyone else hurt the lion, not when she was the only one who seemed to care. The next morning, Ellie woke early, her plan taking shape in her mind. She would find a way to get in touch with the sanctuary directly. The letter she had sent might take too long, or worse, never reach them at all. She needed to act now. Richard was in his office, the door slightly ajar. Ellie crept down the hallway, careful not to make a sound. She peeked inside and saw him sitting at his desk, talking on the phone. His voice was low and clipped, the words sending a shiver through her. "I told you, the deal's going through tonight," he said, his tone impatient. "The buyers are ready. All I need is for you to hold up your end." Ellie's heart raced. Was he talking about the lion? She leaned closer, straining to hear more. Yeah, I know it's risky," Richard continued, "but it's worth it. That thing's worth a fortune, and I'm not letting it slip through my fingers." A lump formed in Ellie's throat. She backed away from the door, her mind spinning. Whatever Richard was planning, it was happening tonight. She had to do something before it was too late. Ellie waited until Richard left the house, his keys jingling as he muttered about final preparations. Once he was gone, she rushed to the kitchen phone and dialed the number printed on the sanctuary's flyer. Her fingers trembled as the phone rang. Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary, a woman's voice answered. "How can I help you?" Ellie took a deep breath. "Hi, my name is Ellie. I think there's a lion in my basement that belongs to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, did you say a lion?" "Yes," Ellie said quickly. "His tag says Balthazar. He's chained up, and my dad." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "He's going to sell him tonight. Please, you have to help." The woman's voice softened. "Ellie, thank you for calling. Can you tell me where you're located?" Ellie gave her address, her voice shaking. The woman promised to send help and told Ellie to stay safe. As she hung up the phone, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight. The rest of the day passed in agonizing silence. Ellie stayed in her room, her ears tuned to every sound outside. When night fell, she heard the familiar rumble of Richard's car returning. She peeked out the window and saw him carrying a large crate toward the basement door. Her stomach churned. She had to act fast. Grabbing her jacket, Ellie slipped out the back door, careful to avoid making any noise. She crouched behind the bushes, waiting. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, headlights appeared in the distance. A van pulled up to the curb and two men stepped out. Ellie's heart pounded as they approached the house. Were they the buyers or the sanctuary team? She couldn't tell. Either way, she had to be ready for whatever came next. The van parked directly in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the night like sharp blades. Ellie crouched lower in the bushes, her small hands clutching the fabric of her jacket. Her pulse roared in her ears as she watched two men step out, their silhouettes tall and imposing. One of them carried a clipboard, while the other wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. They exchanged a few words, then made their way toward the house. Ellie's breath caught as she realized they weren't from the sanctuary. These men were here for the deal Richard had mentioned. Her stomach churned with dread. Inside, Richard stood in the basement, his fingers twitching as he adjusted the chain around the lion's neck. The animal growled softly, its golden eyes following his every move. "Shut up," Richard muttered, yanking on the chain. He glanced at the crate beside him, a massive wooden box reinforced with steel bars. The buyers had insisted on it, claiming it was the safest way to transport a lion without incident. Richard didn't care about safety. All he cared about was the money this transaction would bring. A knock echoed from upstairs. Richard straightened, his lips curling into a cold smile. Right on time, Ellie darted around the side of the house, her heart racing. She couldn't just sit and watch this happen. But what could she do? She was only a child, and Richard wouldn't hesitate to punish her if he caught her interfering. Still, the thought of the lion being taken away, caged forever or worse, was unbearable. As she peered through the basement window, an idea struck her. She spotted the sanctuary's van in the distance, its logo faintly visible under the streetlight. Relief surged through her. They were here, but she had to stall Richard and the buyers long enough for them to act. Inside the house, Richard greeted the men with his usual brusque demeanor. "You've got the payment?" he asked, his voice sharp. The man with the clipboard nodded, pulling a thick envelope from his pocket. $5,000, as agreed. Richard snatched the envelope and flipped through the bills, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Good. The lion's in the basement. Let's get this over with." The three men moved toward the basement door, their footsteps heavy. Ellie's heart pounded as she realized she was running out of time. Thinking quickly, Ellie ran to the back of the house and found a loose brick near the foundation. It was heavy, but she managed to lift it, her small arms straining. With all her strength, she hurled it against the van's back window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the van's alarm blared into the night. The noise sent Richard and the buyers into a frenzy. "What the hell was that?" one of the men barked. Richard stormed upstairs, his face twisted with fury. He threw open the front door, scanning the yard. Ellie pressed herself against the side of the house, holding her breath. "It's probably just some punk kid," Richard growled. "Let's deal with the lion first." The buyers exchanged uneasy glances but followed him back inside. Ellie's relief was short-lived. She turned to run, but a hand grabbed her arm, pulling her back sharply. She let out a startled cry and looked up to see Grant towering over her, his expression grim. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Do you have a death wish?" Ellie struggled against his grip. "They're going to take the lion. I have to stop them. Do you even know what you're up against?" Grant snapped, his voice low but intense. "These guys aren't just buyers, they're traffickers. If they catch you, you're as good as gone." Ellie's eyes filled with tears, but her resolve didn't waver. "I don't care. Someone has to do something." Grant stared at her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Damn it, kid. You're going to get me killed." He released her arm and glanced toward the sanctuary van. "Fine. I'll distract them. You get the sanctuary people to the basement. Got it?" Ellie nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She didn't trust Grant, but she didn't have a choice. While Grant approached the front door, Ellie sprinted toward the sanctuary van. A woman stepped out, her eyes scanning the scene with urgency. Ellie recognized her voice from the phone call. "You're Ellie?" the woman asked, her tone brisk but kind. Ellie nodded, struggling to catch her breath. "They're in the basement. My dad's selling the lion to traffickers." The woman's expression hardened. She motioned to a man in the driver's seat, and they began unloading equipment: ropes, tranquilizer darts, and a large cage. "We'll handle this," the woman said. "Stay out of sight, Ellie. It's dangerous." Inside the basement, the buyers were growing impatient. "This chain isn't going to hold if he gets mad," one of them muttered, eyeing the lion warily. Richard ignored him, securing the last latch on the crate. "He's fine. Let's just get him loaded." As the men moved toward the lion, Grant appeared at the top of the stairs, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Hey boss," he drawled, his tone casual. "Mind if I have a word?" Richard scowled. "Not now, Grant. It's about your daughter," Grant continued, descending the stairs. "She's been snooping around. Might have seen something she shouldn't." Richard froze, his eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" Grant shrugged. "Just figured you'd want to know. Could be a problem later." Ellie watched through the window, her chest tightening as she realized Grant's distraction was working. The sanctuary team was at the back door, preparing to move in. Ellie held her breath, praying they would act quickly. The sanctuary team burst into the basement, their presence startling everyone. The woman stepped forward, her voice commanding. "Step away from the lion. Now!" The buyers exchanged panicked looks. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded. "Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary," she said firmly. "This lion belongs to us, and you're all under suspicion of illegal trafficking." Richard's face turned a deep shade of red. "You have no right to be here," he shouted. "We have every right," the woman shot back. "We contacted law enforcement. They're on their way." Chaos erupted as the buyers tried to flee. Richard lunged at the woman, but Grant stepped in, shoving him back. The lion roared, its powerful voice shaking the walls. Ellie pressed her hands against the window, her heart racing. She couldn't tear her eyes away as the scene unfolded. The sanctuary team worked swiftly, tranquilizing the lion and preparing it for transport. Richard's furious screams echoed through the basement, but it was too late. The sanctuary team had won. Ellie watched as the sanctuary team carefully loaded the lion into their vehicle. Relief washed over her, but it was bittersweet. She had saved the lion, but she knew the battle with Richard was far from over. As the van drove away, Ellie whispered to herself, "You're safe now, Balthazar," but deep down, she knew her own safety was still in question. The following morning, the tension in the Thompson household was suffocating. The sun rose over Aurora, casting golden rays that seemed almost mocking in their warmth. Inside the house, Ellie stayed in her room, clutching her knees to her chest. Her relief from the night before, knowing Balthazar was safe, was quickly replaced by dread. Richard had returned late, slamming doors and pacing the floor with an anger that made the walls vibrate. He hadn't come upstairs yet, but Ellie knew it was only a matter of time before his fury found her. The sanctuary's intervention had exposed his plans, and she suspected he knew she had a hand in it. Downstairs, Richard stood in the kitchen, staring into his coffee mug. His knuckles were white around the handle, his jaw clenched tightly. Across from him sat Grant, who had stayed after the chaos. He leaned back in his chair, his leather jacket draped over the backrest, and a smirk playing on his lips. "Well," Grant drawled, "that was quite the fiasco, wasn't it?" Richard shot him a glare. "If you'd done your damn job instead of playing hero, we wouldn't be in this mess." Grant chuckled, unbothered by the accusation. "Oh, come on, Thompson. You knew the risks. You just didn't think anyone would call you out on it." Richard slammed his mug onto the counter, the coffee sloshing over the edge. "That sanctuary woman ruined everything. And I have a feeling someone in this house helped her." Grant raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his smirk widening. Upstairs, Ellie flinched as she heard the raised voices. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. She thought of Balthazar, safe in the hands of the sanctuary, and clung to that small comfort. But the question gnawed at her. What would Richard do now? The answer came sooner than she expected. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, and her bedroom door burst open. Richard stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice sharp as a knife. Ellie's heart raced, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb with me," Richard roared, stepping closer. "The sanctuary didn't just show up out of nowhere. You were involved, weren't you?" Ellie's chest heaved as she tried to summon the courage to respond. "They came because what you were doing was wrong," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Balthazar didn't belong here." Richard's expression darkened. For a moment, Ellie thought he might strike her, but he merely clenched his fists and took a step back. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he hissed. "You don't know what I've done for this family." "What family?" Ellie shot back, tears streaming down her face. "You don't care about me, and you never cared about Mom." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. Richard's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Grant appeared in the doorway. "Whoa, whoa," Grant said, holding up his hands. "Let's not do anything we'll regret." Richard turned on him. "Stay out of this. Relax, Thompson," Grant said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not going to fix anything by yelling at the kid." Richard glared at him, his chest heaving. Finally, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Ellie collapsed onto her bed, her sobs muffled by her pillow. Grant lingered in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You've got guts, kid," he said finally. "But you'd better watch your back." The atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive over the next few days. Richard barely spoke to Ellie, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Grant seemed to have made himself at home, much to Ellie's discomfort. He spent his days lounging on the couch or poking around the house, his presence a constant reminder that her father's allies were never far away. Ellie avoided both men as much as possible, retreating to her room whenever she could. But even there, she couldn't escape the tension. Her mind raced with thoughts of what Richard might do next. He had lost the lion, but Ellie doubted he would give up so easily. One evening, Ellie overheard a heated conversation between Richard and Grant. She crept to the top of the stairs, crouching low to avoid being seen. "You're lucky I didn't tell them everything," Grant was saying, his tone laced with warning. "If the sanctuary had known about the other animals—" "Shut up," Richard snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know plenty," Grant retorted. "I know you're in over your head. And I know your kids got more guts than you ever will." Ellie's breath caught. Were there more animals? The thought sent a jolt of fear and anger through her. How far had Richard gone in his greed? That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind buzzing with questions. If there were other animals, she had to find them. She couldn't let Richard continue his cruelty, no matter how dangerous it was to intervene. The house was quiet when Ellie slipped out of her room, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. She made her way to Richard's office, her heart pounding. The door was locked, but Ellie had learned long ago how to pick the flimsy mechanism with a paperclip. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cigar smoke and old paper. Ellie rummaged through the desk drawers, her hands trembling. Finally, she found a folder labeled Inventory. She opened it, her eyes scanning the list of names and descriptions. Her stomach churned as she read: Balthazar, lion; Ruby, Bengal tiger; Milo, chimpanzee. Ellie's hands shook as she realized the scope of Richard's operation. Balthazar had been just one of many. Her father was keeping other animals somewhere, and they were still in danger. The next morning, Ellie confronted Richard in the kitchen. "Where are the other animals?" she demanded, her voice steady despite her fear. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," Ellie said, holding up the folder. "I know about Ruby and Milo. Where are they?" Richard's face darkened. He took a step toward her, but Grant intervened, stepping between them. "Careful, Thompson," Grant said, his tone light but warning. "Looks like the kid's smarter than you thought." Richard glared at both of them, his fists clenched. "You don't know what you're getting into, Ellie," he said through gritted teeth. "Stay out of it." But Ellie had made up her mind. She couldn't stay out of it, not when innocent lives were at stake. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across Ellie's small room. She sat on her bed, clutching the folder she had taken from Richard's office, her fingers tracing the names of the animals listed. Ruby, Milo. How many others had there been? The thought made her stomach twist. It wasn't just Balthazar who had suffered. There were others still trapped, still waiting for help. The sound of muffled voices drifted up the stairs, drawing Ellie's attention. She tiptoed to the door and pressed her ear against it. Richard's voice rumbled, low and tense, followed by Grant's sarcastic tone. "I'm telling you, she knows too much," Richard growled. "Well, whose fault is that?" Grant shot back. "You're the one leaving your dirty laundry lying around." Ellie's chest tightened. They were talking about her. She stepped away from the door, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here, not when Richard was getting more dangerous by the day. She had to act, but she didn't know where to start. Later that day, Richard stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Ellie waited until his car roared down the street before venturing downstairs. Grant was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a magazine, his leather jacket tossed carelessly over the armrest. He glanced up as Ellie approached, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, kid?" he asked, his tone bored. Ellie hesitated, then held up the folder. "I know about the other animals," she said quietly. "Where are they?" Grant raised an eyebrow, sitting up slowly. "And what makes you think I'd tell you?" "Because you helped me save Balthazar," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "You might act like you don't care, but I think you do." Grant chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a piece of work. You know that?" He leaned back, studying her for a moment. "What makes you think you can do anything about it?" Ellie's hands clenched into fists. "Because someone has to. And if you won't help me, I'll find someone who will." Grant's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something Ellie couldn't quite place. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're gonna get yourself killed, kid." Maybe Ellie shot back, her voice steady. "But at least I'll try." For a long moment, Grant said nothing. Then he stood, grabbing his jacket. "Fine, I'll tell you where they are. But if this goes south, it's on you." Grant led Ellie to the garage, where Richard kept a separate set of keys hidden in an old toolbox. "He's got a storage unit on the edge of town," Grant explained. "That's where he stashes the animals until he finds buyers." Ellie's heart sank at the thought. "How many are there?" Grant shrugged. "Depends on the week. But I'd bet Ruby and Milo are still there." Ellie nodded, determination hardening her expression. "We have to get them out." Grant raised an eyebrow. "We? You said it yourself," Ellie replied. "I'm gonna get myself killed if I do this alone." Grant laughed, shaking his head. "Kid, you're crazy. But fine. Let's go." The storage unit was a nondescript building on the outskirts of Aurora, surrounded by chain-link fencing and overgrown weeds. The air was thick with tension as Grant parked the car a short distance away. Ellie's hands trembled as she stepped out, the folder clutched tightly to her chest. "This is it," Grant said, nodding toward the rows of units. "His is in the back." Ellie followed him, her heart pounding. The storage facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet. As they approached the unit, Grant pulled out the keys and unlocked the heavy metal door. The smell hit Ellie first, a sickly mix of urine, sweat, and decay. She gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. Inside, the dim light revealed a makeshift setup of cages and tarps. Ellie's eyes widened as she took in the sight. A Bengal tiger lay curled in one corner, its fur matted and its ribs visible. In another cage, a chimpanzee sat huddled against the bars, its eyes dull and lifeless. Ellie's heart broke at the sight. "We have to get them out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "Easier said than done," Grant muttered. "You got a plan?" Ellie hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. "We could call the sanctuary." Grant frowned. "You think they'll just show up again? They're probably keeping an eye on your dad now. They can't risk coming here without backup." Ellie's shoulders slumped. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't leave the animals here. "Then we'll do it ourselves," she said quietly. Grant stared at her, then sighed. "You're lucky I don't have anything better to do." They worked quickly, unlocking the cages and coaxing the animals out. Ruby, the tiger, growled softly but didn't resist as Grant led her toward the truck. Milo clung to Ellie's arm, his small hands gripping her jacket tightly. As they loaded the animals, Ellie felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it felt like they were making a difference. But that hope was short-lived. The sound of a car engine roared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Ellie's blood ran cold. "He's coming," she whispered. Grant cursed under his breath. "Get in the truck. Now!" They barely had time to climb into the vehicle before Richard's car screeched to a halt in front of the unit. He jumped out, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell are you doing?" he bellowed, striding toward them. Grant revved the engine, his jaw clenched. "Hold on, kid." The truck lurched forward, speeding past Richard before he could react. Ellie clung to Milo, her heart racing as they tore down the gravel road. She glanced back and saw Richard chasing them on foot, his shouts fading into the distance. Ellie didn't relax until they were miles away from the storage unit. The animals were safe for now, but she knew this wasn't over. Richard wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. As they drove toward the sanctuary, Ellie made a silent promise to herself. She would protect these animals no matter what it took. But deep down, she knew the real fight was only just beginning. The road ahead stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the truck's headlights. Grant's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Beside him, Ellie sat silently, cradling Milo, the chimpanzee, who clung to her with a desperation that broke her heart. In the back of the truck, Ruby the tiger lay motionless, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow. "Where are we going?" Ellie finally asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Sanctuary," Grant replied curtly, his jaw tight. "The one you called before. They'll know what to do." Ellie nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and fear. Relief that the animals might finally be safe, and fear of what her father might do when he realized what she'd done. The truck pulled off the highway onto a gravel road, leading to a small clearing surrounded by trees. A modest building with the Silver Creek Wildlife Sanctuary logo painted on its side stood at the end of the path. The air was cool and quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires. "They'll be here soon," Grant said, cutting the engine. "Stay in the truck." Ellie watched as he climbed out, slamming the door behind him. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the truck, his face illuminated by the flickering glow. Ellie stayed put as instructed, but her nerves were frayed. Milo whimpered softly in her arms, and she stroked his fur, murmuring soothing words. Minutes passed like hours. Ellie kept glancing toward the dark road, half expecting Richard's car to appear at any moment. Just as her anxiety reached its peak, a van pulled into the clearing, its headlights piercing the darkness. The sanctuary team emerged, led by the same woman Ellie had spoken to before. Her presence brought a wave of reassurance, but Ellie could see the tension in her expression as she approached Grant. "You've got the animals?" the woman asked, her tone brisk. Grant gestured to the truck bed. "Tigers in the back. Chimps with the kid." The woman's eyes softened when she saw Ellie, but her focus quickly returned to the task at hand. "Let's move quickly. If Richard tracks you here..." "He won't," Grant interrupted. "Not yet. Anyway." The team worked efficiently, transferring Ruby and Milo to secure transport cages. Ellie watched from the sidelines, her heart heavy. She knew this was the right thing, but the weight of what she had done, and the consequences that awaited her, pressed down like a storm cloud. As the sanctuary van prepared to leave, the woman approached Ellie. "You did a brave thing," she said gently. "These animals owe their lives to you." Ellie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "What's going to happen to them?" "They'll get the care they need," the woman assured her. "And we'll make sure your father can't hurt any more animals." Ellie wanted to believe her, but doubt lingered. Richard was resourceful and relentless. She knew this wasn't the end. The sanctuary van disappeared into the night, leaving Ellie and Grant alone in the clearing. Grant climbed back into the truck, motioning for Ellie to do the same. She hesitated, her gaze lingering on the empty road. "What's the holdup?" Grant asked, his tone impatient. Ellie climbed in without answering. The drive back to Aurora was tense and silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, Grant pulled the truck over and turned off the engine. "This is where I leave you," he said, leaning back in his seat. Ellie stared at him, confusion and panic flooding her chest. "What? You're leaving?" Grant sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Kid, I've done more than I should have already. Your dad's not just gonna let this slide. If I stick around, it's only a matter of time before he comes after me." Ellie's voice wavered. "But I need your help. I can't do this alone." "You're tougher than you think," Grant said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I've got my own problems to deal with. You'll figure it out." Ellie bit her lip, fighting back tears. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stay, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Grant wasn't the hero she'd hoped for. He was a man running from his own demons, and she was just another complication in his life. Grant opened the door and stepped out, tossing Ellie the keys. "Take the truck. You'll need it more than I will." Before Ellie could respond, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone in the cab of the truck. She gripped the keys tightly, her chest aching with a mix of anger and despair. Ellie drove the truck back to her neighborhood, parking it a few streets away to avoid suspicion. The house was dark when she entered, but the oppressive silence told her Richard was inside, waiting. She crept up the stairs, each step feeling like a countdown to disaster. When she reached her room, she found the door ajar. Her heart sank as she pushed it open. The sight that greeted her made her stomach drop. Her belongings were strewn across the floor. Her books, her toys, even her school papers. Everything had been ransacked, and in the center of it all stood Richard, his face shadowed but unmistakably furious. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can betray me and get away with it?" Ellie's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I didn't betray you," she said, her voice shaking. "I did the right thing." Richard stepped closer, his towering presence making her feel small. "The right thing," he spat. "You've ruined everything, Ellie. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ellie's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to back down. "I saved them," she said firmly, "and I'd do it again." Richard's expression darkened. For a moment, Ellie thought he might strike her, but instead he turned and stormed out of the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the house, followed by the slam of the front door. Ellie sank to the floor, her body trembling. She had won a small victory, but it felt hollow. She had lost Grant, and now she was truly alone in a house that no longer felt like home. As she sat there in the wreckage of her room, Ellie vowed to herself that she wouldn't give up. She might be alone, but she wasn't powerless. There were still battles to fight, and she would find a way to win them. The morning sun rose reluctantly over Aurora, its weak light doing little to brighten the Thompson household. Ellie sat on her bed, staring at the mess of her belongings strewn across the room. Her heart was heavy, the fear and anger from the previous night clinging to her like a shadow. She hadn't slept, her thoughts consumed by the confrontation with Richard and the absence of Grant. She felt like a ship lost at sea, without a map or compass. Yet, amidst her despair, a flicker of determination burned. There were still animals out there, and her father wasn't going to stop. If no one else would fight him, she would. Downstairs, the house was silent. Richard hadn't come home after storming out the night before. Ellie crept into the kitchen, her stomach growling from hunger. She opened the fridge, grabbing a piece of bread and nibbling on it absent-mindedly. The quiet felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she froze, her heart racing. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Richard's imposing figure appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his mouth twisted into a sneer. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "Just getting breakfast," Ellie stammered, her grip tightening on the counter. Richard stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You've made things worse, Ellie. Not just for me, but for you." Ellie's chest tightened, but she refused to let him see her fear. "I'm not scared of you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Richard chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "You should be." The day passed in uneasy silence. Richard disappeared into his office, slamming the door behind him. Ellie stayed in her room, trying to piece together a plan. She knew she couldn't wait for someone to save her. She had to take action. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was faint, hesitant. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She tiptoed downstairs and peeked through the curtain. A man in a brown delivery uniform stood on the porch, holding a package. Ellie opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Ellie Thompson?" the man asked, glancing at the label on the box. "Yes," she replied, her voice wary. "This is for you." He handed her the package and left without another word. Ellie closed the door and carried the box to the kitchen table. It was small and plain, with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a single envelope and a flash drive. She unfolded the letter inside, her eyes scanning the neatly typed words. "Ellie, you don't know me, but I know your father. I know what he's done, and I know what he's planning. The flash drive contains evidence, enough to stop him if you're brave enough to use it. But be careful. He's more dangerous than you think. A friend." Ellie's pulse quickened as she turned the flash drive over in her hand. What kind of evidence did it hold? And who had sent it? Her thoughts swirled with questions, but one thing was clear. This was her chance to expose Richard and stop his cruelty once and for all. That night, Ellie waited until the house was quiet. Richard was asleep in his room, and the soft hum of his snoring drifted through the walls. Ellie crept downstairs to the old family computer in the living room. She inserted the flash drive, her hands shaking with anticipation. The screen flickered to life, displaying a folder labeled Thompson Files. Ellie clicked on it, and a series of documents and videos appeared. Her breath caught as she began to read. The documents detailed Richard's involvement in an international trafficking ring, specializing in exotic animals. There were invoices for transactions, records of shipments, and even photographs of animals locked in cages. Ellie's stomach churned as she clicked on one of the videos. The footage showed a tiger pacing restlessly in a cramped cage, its roars echoing off metal walls. Another clip showed a chimpanzee being dragged by a chain, its cries of distress piercing the air. Ellie covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "This is what he's been hiding," she whispered to herself. "This is what he's done." Her sorrow quickly turned to anger. Richard wasn't just a bad father, he was a monster, and now Ellie had the proof to stop him. The next morning, Ellie didn't wait for Richard to leave the house. She confronted him in the kitchen, holding the flash drive tightly in her hand. "I know everything," she said, her voice steady. Richard looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "This." Ellie held up the flash drive. "I know about the trafficking. I've seen the videos. I know what you've done." Richard's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't have gone digging where you don't belong. You don't get to tell me what I can and can't do," Ellie shot back. "Not anymore." Richard stood, towering over her. "And what do you think you're going to do with that? Take it to the police? They won't believe you. You're just a kid." Ellie's hands shook, but she refused to back down. "Maybe they won't, but the sanctuary will. And so will the media." Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ellie thought he might strike her. But instead, he smirked, his expression cold and calculating. "You think you're smart," he said, "but you don't understand the world, Ellie. It's not about right or wrong. It's about power. And you don't have any." Ellie glared at him, her fists clenched. "We'll see about that." Ellie spent the rest of the day planning her next move. She knew she couldn't trust the local authorities, not when Richard had connections in the town. Instead, she decided to contact the sanctuary again. She wrote an email detailing everything she had found, attaching copies of the files from the flash drive. Her finger hovered over the send button, her heart pounding. Once she sent this, there would be no turning back. Richard would know, and the consequences could be dangerous. But she couldn't let fear stop her. Taking a deep breath, Ellie clicked send. That evening, as Ellie lay in bed, a strange calm settled over her. For the first time in months, she felt like she had taken control of her life. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she had done the right thing. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside her window. Ellie sat up, her pulse quickening. She crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. Richard was standing in the yard, talking to someone. A tall man in a black coat. Ellie couldn't hear their conversation, but the sight of them filled her with dread. Richard's gestures were angry, his voice low but urgent. Ellie ducked away from the window, her mind racing. Whatever they were planning, she had to be ready. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of day that seemed to press down on everything with a heavy, oppressive weight. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, the silence around her deafening. The air was tense, charged with an electricity she couldn't quite explain. Across from her, Richard stood leaning against the counter, nursing his coffee. His expression was unreadable, but his presence felt like a storm about to break. "Ellie," he said finally, his voice unusually calm. "We need to talk." Ellie's stomach tightened. She glanced at him warily, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "About what?" Richard set his mug down and crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on her. "You've been meddling in things you don't understand. Sending emails, making calls, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Ellie's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain still. "You don't get to tell me what I can or can't do," she said quietly. "Not when you're the one doing something wrong." Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're so smart, don't you? You think you've got it all figured out?" Ellie didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to speak without her voice shaking. Richard leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You've made things worse for yourself, Ellie, and for me, but I'm going to give you one chance to fix this." Ellie blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" "You're going to take back what you sent," Richard said, his tone cold and deliberate. "You're going to tell them you made it all up, that you were just a kid acting out. And then we're going to move on from this." Ellie stared at him, her chest tightening with disbelief. "You want me to lie? After everything you've done?" Richard's lips curved into a smirk, but there was no warmth in it. "It's not a lie, Ellie. It's survival. You don't understand the kind of people I'm dealing with. If you keep this up, they won't just come after me. They'll come after you." Ellie's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not going to lie for you." Richard's expression darkened, his voice growing colder. "Don't be stupid, Ellie. This isn't a game." "I'm not scared of you," Ellie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let you hurt anyone else." Richard's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, Ellie thought he might lash out, but instead, he stepped back and let out a bitter laugh. "You've got guts," he said. "I'll give you that, but guts won't save you when they come knocking." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Ellie alone with her racing thoughts. She knew she had crossed a line, and there would be no going back now. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ellie stayed in her room, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. She had expected Richard to lash out, to try to intimidate her into submission. But his calm, calculated demeanor had been even more unsettling. He was planning something, she could feel it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie sat at her desk, staring at her email inbox. The sanctuary had replied to her message, thanking her for the evidence and assuring her that they were working with authorities to take action. The words brought a flicker of hope, but they also reminded her of the danger she faced. A soft knock at her door startled her. Ellie turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Dinner's ready," he said flatly. Ellie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her not to trust him, but refusing to come down would only make things worse. She nodded and followed him to the dining room. The table was set with an unusual care. A roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans arranged neatly on serving dishes. Ellie frowned, the sight of the elaborate meal only heightening her unease. "Sit," Richard said, motioning to her usual spot. Ellie obeyed, watching him warily as he took the seat across from her. He served himself a generous portion of food but didn't touch it. Instead, he rested his elbows on the table and studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You remind me of your mother," he said suddenly, his voice softer than before. She was stubborn too, always thought she could fix everything. Ellie's chest tightened at the mention of her mother. "She tried to help people," she said quietly, "not hurt them." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. "I didn't want things to end up like this," Richard said finally. "But sometimes you don't get a choice." Ellie looked at him, her brows furrowing. "You always have a choice." Richard's gaze hardened, the momentary vulnerability vanishing. "Then make yours," he said coldly. "Stop fighting me, or deal with the consequences." That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Richard's words had been a warning, but they had also been a challenge. He thought he could scare her into submission, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the hours crept by, Ellie heard the faint hum of a car engine outside. She slipped out of bed and peered through the curtain, her heart skipping a beat. A black sedan was parked across the street, its headlights off. Ellie could just make out the silhouette of a man sitting in the driver's seat, his head tilted as if watching the house. Her stomach churned. Richard wasn't bluffing. Whoever he was involved with, they were watching, and they weren't going to stop. Ellie spent the next morning in a daze, her fear growing with every passing minute. She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She had to get out to find help before it was too late. She packed a small bag with essentials, a change of clothes, a flashlight, and the flash drive. As she zipped it shut, her eyes fell on the photograph on her nightstand. It was a picture of her with her mother, taken years ago at a park. Her mother's smile was warm and full of life, a stark contrast to the shadowy figure Richard had become. Ellie tucked the photo into her bag and slung it over her shoulder. She didn't have a plan, but she couldn't let that stop her. Taking a deep breath, she crept downstairs and slipped out the back door. The air was crisp and cool as Ellie made her way down the quiet street. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, each step carrying her further away from the life she had known, and closer to the unknown danger that awaited. The night air was heavy as Ellie walked through the quiet streets of Aurora. Her small bag weighed on her shoulder, but the weight of her fear was far heavier. She glanced over her shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see Richard's car or the black sedan following her. The silence pressed against her ears, amplifying the sound of her sneakers scuffing against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay in that house any longer. The thought of Richard's cold threats and the mysterious man in the sedan made her chest tighten. She needed help, but from who? The sanctuary had promised to act, but Ellie knew they couldn't provide the immediate protection she needed. And with Grant gone, she felt more alone than ever. As she passed a dimly lit diner, the faint smell of coffee and grease wafted through the air. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Ellie hesitated outside the diner, her reflection faint in the glass. Inside, a few scattered patrons sat at booths, their heads bent over plates of food. She pushed the door open, the bell above jingling softly. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile approached her. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. Ellie swallowed hard. "Just water, please." The waitress nodded and led her to a booth near the back. Ellie sank into the seat, clutching her bag tightly. She glanced around the diner, her eyes darting to the door every few seconds. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The water arrived along with a small plate of fries. Ellie looked up at the waitress, surprised. "On the house," the woman said with a wink. "You look like you could use it." Ellie managed a small smile. "Thank you." She ate slowly, her mind racing. She had to think of her next move. She couldn't stay here all night, but where else could she go? As she pondered her options, the bell above the door jingled again. Ellie froze as she saw a familiar figure step inside. Grant. His leather jacket was rumpled, and his eyes looked tired, but he carried the same air of casual confidence. He scanned the diner, and his gaze landed on Ellie. He smirked and sauntered over to her booth. "Running away from home, huh?" he said, sliding into the seat across from her. Ellie's heart pounded. "What are you doing here?" "Could ask you the same thing," Grant replied, leaning back against the booth. "But I think I already know." Ellie stared at him, unsure whether to feel relieved or angry. "You left." "Yeah, and now I'm back," Grant said with a shrug. "You're welcome." Ellie narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Grant's smirk faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Because I heard some things. Things that made me think you might need backup." Ellie frowned. "What kind of things?" Grant leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Your dad's not just in trouble, kid. He's got people after him. Dangerous people. And from what I hear, they're not too happy about your little stunt with the sanctuary." Ellie's chest tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know that," Grant said. "But these guys don't care about right or wrong. They care about their money. And right now, you're a liability." Ellie's hands tightened around her glass. "So what am I supposed to do?" Grant sighed. "First, you stick with me. Second, we figure out how to stop your dad before things get worse." Reluctantly, Ellie agreed to go with Grant. The two left the diner and climbed into a beat-up car he had borrowed from a friend. As they drove through the dark streets, Ellie couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and unease. Grant had come back, But could she really trust him? Where are we going? She asked as the car turned onto a narrow side street. Someplace safe, Grant replied. For now. That safe place turned out to be an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was cold and drafty, its walls covered in graffiti. Ellie shivered as they stepped inside, the echo of their footsteps filling the empty space. This is safe? She asked skeptically. It's off the grid, Grant said. No one will think to look for us here. Ellie wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. She sat on an old crate, clutching her bag as Grant paced the room, muttering to himself. Hours passed, and Ellie's exhaustion caught up with her. She dozed off, her head resting on her bag. When she woke, Grant was sitting nearby, staring out a broken window. What's your deal? Ellie asked groggily. Grant glanced at her, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? Why are you helping me? Ellie asked. You could have just stayed gone. Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair. Let's just say I've got my reasons. Ellie frowned. That's not an answer. Grant hesitated, then spoke quietly. Your dad and I, we go way back. Let's just say I owe him one. Or at least I used to. Ellie's brow furrowed. What happened? Grant's jaw tightened. He changed. Got greedy. Started doing things I couldn't be part of. But I didn't stop him. I just walked away. Ellie studied him, her anger softening. You're trying to make up for it. Maybe, Grant said. Or maybe I just don't want to see another kid get hurt because of him. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of a car engine outside. Grant's body tensed, and he motioned for Ellie to stay quiet. He crept to the window, peering out cautiously. It's them, he whispered, his voice grim. Ellie's heart raced. Who? Grant turned to her, his expression serious. The guys your dad works for. Stay here. Before Ellie could protest, Grant slipped out the back door, leaving her alone in the warehouse. She pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. She could hear voices outside, low and tense. Her stomach churned as she strained to make out the words. You're late, one of the men said. Had some things to take care of, Grant replied, his tone casual. You're not supposed to be here, another voice growled. Thompson said. Forget what Thompson said, Grant interrupted. I've got information you're gonna want to hear. Ellie's chest tightened. What was he doing? Was he trying to protect her? Or betray her? The voices grew louder, the tension in the air palpable. Ellie knew she couldn't just sit and wait. She had to do something. But what? Ellie pressed herself against the cold warehouse wall, her breath shallow as she listened to the voices outside. Her mind raced. Grant had gone to confront the men. But why? Was he protecting her, or did he have another motive? Every instinct told her to stay hidden, but her curiosity and fear kept her rooted in place. You've got information? One of the men outside said, his voice sharp and skeptical. This better be worth our time. Grant's voice was steady, tinged with defiance. It's about Thompson's kid. She's got the flash drive. Ellie's heart stopped. She clutched her bag tightly, the small device inside suddenly feeling like a lead weight. How could he sell her out like this? A surge of anger and betrayal coursed through her. But she couldn't afford to lose focus now. She's a liability, another man growled. Thompson's already on thin ice with the boss. This kid's putting us all at risk. Grant chuckled darkly. Relax. I've got her stashed. She's not going anywhere. Ellie's fists clenched. Her body screamed at her to run, but her mind calculated her next move. She wasn't going to let these men catch her. Not without a fight. The conversation continued outside, the tension thick in the air. Ellie crept toward the broken window near the back of the warehouse, peeking out cautiously. The three men stood near a black sedan, their faces obscured by the shadows. Grant was leaning casually against the car, his hands in his jacket pockets, but his posture was tense. She's just a kid, one of the men said. Why not grab her? Take the drive and be done with it? Grant shrugged. Sure, go ahead. But good luck explaining to the boss why you scared off the only leverage we've got against Thompson. The man scowled. And what's your plan, genius? Grant straightened, his voice dropping. We wait. Let her think she's safe. Then we make our move. Ellie's stomach churned. She had trusted Grant, relied on him. Now she realized she was on her own again. Ellie moved quickly and quietly, grabbing her bag and slipping toward the back of the warehouse. She couldn't stay here. If Grant was truly working with these men, it was only a matter of time before they found her. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse as one of the men stepped inside. "Kid!" he called out, his voice laced with mockery. "We know you're here. Why don't you come out and make this easy?" Ellie's heart pounded as she ducked behind a stack of crates. She peeked around the corner, spotting the man moving through the dimly lit space. His figure was hulking, his movements deliberate. "Don't make me chase you," he warned, his voice echoing. "I'm not in the mood for games." Ellie's mind raced. She spotted a rusted metal pipe on the ground nearby and grabbed it, her small hands trembling. She couldn't outrun him, but maybe she could outsmart him. The man moved closer, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete floor. Ellie crouched low, holding the pipe tightly. When he stepped past her hiding spot, she swung with all her might, hitting his leg. He let out a roar of pain, stumbling forward. Ellie bolted toward the exit, her legs moving faster than they ever had. She could hear the man shouting behind her, the sound of his rage spurring her on. As she reached the door, she collided with another figure. Grant. "Ellie, stop!" he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Let me go!" she screamed, struggling against his grip. "You lied to me. You're working with them." "Ellie, listen to me," Grant said, his voice urgent. "I'm not on their side. I'm trying to protect you." Ellie glared at him, her eyes blazing with fury. "By selling me out? I had to make them think I was helping them," Grant explained. "If they thought I was protecting you, they would have killed me. I needed to buy us time." Ellie hesitated, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Why should I believe you?" Grant's expression softened, his voice lowering. "Because if I wanted to turn you in, I would have done it already." Ellie searched his face for any sign of deceit. She wanted to believe him, but the sting of his earlier betrayal still lingered. Before she could respond, the sound of the man from earlier grew closer. "Kid!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "You're not getting away." Grant tightened his grip on Ellie's arm. "Come on, we've got to move." Grant led Ellie through a side door, the two of them slipping into the shadows outside. The black sedan was still parked in front of the warehouse, but the other men were nowhere in sight. Grant motioned for Ellie to stay low as they crept toward his car, which was parked a few blocks away. As they climbed into the car, Ellie glanced at Grant, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are we going now?" "Somewhere they won't find us," Grant said, starting the engine. "But first, we need to talk about that flash drive." Ellie tensed, clutching her bag protectively. "What about it?" Grant glanced at her, his expression serious. "That drive has enough evidence to take down your dad and everyone he's working with. But if it falls into the wrong hands, it could also get a lot of people hurt." Ellie frowned. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Grant sighed, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "We find someone who can use it the right way. Someone who can end this for good." The car sped through the quiet streets, the tension inside it palpable. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to process everything. She wanted to trust Grant, but the memory of his earlier betrayal still stung. And yet, he had saved her tonight, risked his life to get her out. "I know someone who can help," Grant said finally, breaking the silence. "But it's going to be dangerous. If you come with me, there's no turning back." Ellie met his gaze, her fear tempered by a growing resolve. "I'm not turning back," Grant nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good. Then let's end this." As the car disappeared into the night, Ellie felt a strange mix of fear and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let her father's crimes go unpunished. The early morning sun was just beginning to rise, its pale light washing over the empty roads as Grant's car sped toward the outskirts of Aurora. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, clutching her bag tightly. The weight of the flash drive inside felt heavier with each passing mile. She glanced at Grant, who was focused on the road ahead, his jaw set in determination. "Where are we going?" Ellie asked, her voice breaking the tense silence. "To someone who knows how to deal with people like your dad," Grant replied without taking his eyes off the road. "An old friend of mine. If anyone can help us, it's him." Ellie frowned. "What makes you think we can trust him?" Grant hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Because I don't have a choice. And neither do you." They arrived at a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods. The structure was small and weathered, its wooden exterior darkened with age. Grant parked the car a short distance away and motioned for Ellie to stay close as they approached the front door. "Who lives here?" Ellie whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the dense forest surrounding them. "Henry," Grant said, "used to be a journalist. One of the best back when he still had a career. Now he's more of a freelance investigator." Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Why doesn't he have a career anymore?" Grant smirked. "Let's just say he made enemies in high places." Before Ellie could ask more, Grant knocked on the door. Moments later, it creaked open, revealing a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and piercing gray eyes. He wore a rumpled flannel shirt and jeans, his posture relaxed but alert. "Grant," the man said, his voice gravelly, "you've got some nerve showing up here." "Good to see you too, Henry," Grant replied with a wry smile. "Mind if we come in?" Henry's sharp gaze shifted to Ellie, then back to Grant. "What's this about?" "It's complicated," Grant said, "but I'll explain everything. We just need your help." After a moment's hesitation, Henry stepped aside, allowing them to enter. The interior of the cabin was cluttered with stacks of papers, books, and old coffee mugs. A corkboard on one wall was covered in newspaper clippings and photographs connected by strings of red yarn. Henry motioned for them to sit at the small kitchen table. "Start talking," he said, leaning against the counter. Grant explained the situation in broad strokes, leaving out the most incriminating details about Richard. Ellie could feel Henry's eyes on her, studying her closely as Grant spoke. When Grant finished, Henry crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "So, you're telling me this kid has evidence that could blow the lid off an international trafficking ring?" Henry said, his tone laced with doubt. "And you think bringing her here is the best move?" "She needs someone who knows how to handle this," Grant said. "And you're the best I know." Henry snorted. "Flattery won't get you anywhere, Grant." Ellie finally spoke up, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "It's not just about my dad. It's about all the animals he's hurt and all the people he's working with. Someone has to stop them." Henry's gaze softened slightly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Let me see the drive." Ellie hesitated, her fingers tightening around her bag. She didn't fully trust Henry, but she knew they didn't have many options. Slowly, she pulled out the flash drive and handed it to him. Henry plugged it into an old laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. His eyes scanned the files, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. "This is bad," he muttered, mostly to himself. "Really bad." "What do you mean?" Ellie asked. Henry leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "Your dad isn't just a small-time trafficker. He's connected to some major players. Politicians, corporations, even law enforcement. Taking him down isn't going to be easy." Ellie's chest tightened. "But it's possible, right?" Henry glanced at her, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's possible, but it's going to take more than this to bring him down." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Henry stiffened, his eyes darting toward the window. "Were you followed?" he asked, his voice low. "No," Grant said firmly. "I made sure of it." Henry didn't look convinced. He grabbed a shotgun from behind the door and motioned for Ellie and Grant to stay put. Ellie's heart pounded as she heard voices outside, muffled but unmistakably angry. A moment later, the door burst open, and two men stormed inside. Ellie recognized them immediately. They were the same men from the warehouse. Her stomach dropped. Well, one of them sneered, his gaze locking onto Ellie. Found the kid. Henry raised the shotgun, his expression cold. You've got about 3 seconds to turn around and leave. The second man chuckled darkly. You really think that'll stop us, old man? Grant moved to shield Ellie, his jaw clenched. Back off, he warned. You don't want to do this. The first man sneered. Oh, we want to do this. Chaos erupted as the men lunged forward. Henry fired a warning shot into the air, the deafening sound making Ellie's ears ring. Grant tackled one of the men, the two of them grappling on the floor. Ellie scrambled backward, clutching her bag as the second man advanced toward her. Hand over the drive. Kid, he snarled, his hand reaching out. No! Ellie shouted, clutching the bag tighter. The man grabbed her arm, yanking her toward him. Ellie kicked and struggled, her mind racing. Her hand brushed against a heavy paperweight on the table, and she swung it with all her strength, hitting the man's head. He stumbled back with a curse, giving Ellie enough time to dart toward the corner of the room. Henry leveled the shotgun at the man, his voice icy. Get out. Now. The men exchanged a glance, weighing their odds. Finally, they retreated, muttering curses under their breath as they stumbled back to their car. The sound of the engine roaring to life signaled their departure. The cabin fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of its occupants. Ellie sank to the floor, her body trembling. Grant helped her up, his expression grim. You okay? He asked. Ellie nodded, though her legs felt like jelly. What do we do now? Henry locked the door, his face pale but resolute. We keep fighting. But if they know you're here, it's only going to get harder. Ellie met his gaze, her fear tempered by a growing determination. Then let's make it harder for them too. The tension in the cabin was so thick it felt like the walls themselves were closing in. Ellie paced the small space, her mind racing. Every creak of the old floorboards seemed louder than it should have been, and every shadow outside the window felt like an encroaching danger. Grant sat at the kitchen table, nursing a fresh bruise on his jaw, while Henry loaded fresh shells into his shotgun. His expression was grim, and the lines on his face seemed deeper in the flickering light of the overhead bulb. They'll be back, Henry said, breaking the silence. And next time, they won't come alone. Ellie stopped pacing, her eyes darting between the two men. What do we do now? They're not going to stop until they get the flash drive. Henry glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. We make sure they don't get it. The evidence on that drive is your father's Achilles heel. Without it, he'll keep getting away with everything. Ellie clutched her bag protectively. Then we have to get it to someone who can use it. The sanctuary, the media, the police, someone. Grant frowned, leaning back in his chair. It's not that simple. Your dad's got people in his pocket. The wrong move, and this evidence disappears before it sees the light of day. Henry nodded. He's right. If we're going to take your father down, we have to be smart about it. One wrong step, and you'll be the one in danger. Ellie's chest tightened. I'm already in danger. So are the animals. I don't care how risky it is. I'm not letting him win. As night fell, Henry suggested they take shifts keeping watch. Ellie stayed near the window, her eyes scanning the dark forest for any sign of movement. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustling leaf and distant sound made her pulse quicken. Hey, Grant said softly, pulling up a chair beside her. You okay? Ellie shrugged, her hands gripping the windowsill. Not really, but I'll survive. Grant leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're tougher than you look, kid. Ellie glanced at him, her expression skeptical. Am I? Because right now, I feel like a scared little girl. That's the thing about being tough, Grant said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You don't feel it. You just keep going anyway. Ellie's gaze softened, but she didn't respond. The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Around midnight, Ellie jolted awake to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. She had fallen asleep in her chair, her head resting against the cold glass of the window. Grant and Henry were already on high alert, their expressions grim. They're here, Henry muttered, grabbing his shotgun. Stay back, Ellie? Ellie's heart pounded as she peered through the window. A pair of headlights illuminated the clearing outside the cabin. Two black SUVs pulled up, their engines idling as several men stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothing, their movements precise and deliberate. "They brought backup," Grant said, his voice low. "Figures." Henry positioned himself near the door, his grip steady on the shotgun. "We can't take them all. We need to find another way out." Grant nodded, motioning for Ellie to grab her bag. "Come on. We're leaving." Ellie hesitated, glancing back at the men outside. "What about you?" she asked Henry. "I'll buy you time," Henry said firmly. "Go. Now." Ellie's throat tightened, but she didn't argue. Grant grabbed her hand and led her toward the back of the cabin. They slipped out through a side door, the cold night air biting at Ellie's skin. The forest loomed before them, dark and foreboding. "This way," Grant whispered, pulling her toward a narrow trail. The sounds of shouting and gunfire erupted behind them, making Ellie's heart race. She clutched her bag tightly, her legs aching as she struggled to keep up with Grant. The trail was uneven and littered with roots, and every step felt like a struggle. "We'll circle back to the car," Grant said, his voice low but urgent. "If we're lucky, they won't see us." Ellie nodded, her chest heaving. She didn't want to think about what was happening to Henry back at the cabin. She just had to believe he'd be okay. They reached the car just as the shouting grew louder in the distance. Grant unlocked the doors and ushered Ellie inside. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up clouds of dust. Ellie glanced out the back window, her hands trembling. "Do you think Henry—" she began, her voice breaking. Grant cut her off. He knew what he was doing. "We have to keep moving." Ellie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to focus. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere far from here," Grant said. "We need to lay low until we figure out our next move." Hours later, they pulled into a small motel on the edge of a sleepy town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a dim red glow over the parking lot. Grant checked them in under a fake name, paying in cash. Ellie stayed close, her nerves frayed. The room was small and musty, with faded wallpaper and an old television in the corner. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her bag clutched to her chest. Grant paced the room, his expression grim. "We've got to be smart about this," he said. "We can't keep running forever." Ellie looked up at him, her voice quiet but firm. "Then let's stop running. Let's take this to someone who can help." Grant sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told you, the wrong move." "We'll find the right one," Ellie interrupted. "We have to." Grant studied her for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, we'll figure it out." As Ellie lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind buzzed with fear and determination. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until her father's crimes were exposed. Somewhere out there, Henry was buying her time. She wouldn't let it go to waste. The small motel room felt stifling as Ellie woke the next morning, the events of the previous night pressing on her chest like a heavy weight. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the faint light streaming through the dusty blinds. Across the room, Grant sat in a chair by the window, his gaze fixed on the parking lot below. "Did you sleep?" Ellie asked, her voice hoarse. Grant shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Not much. I've been keeping an eye out." Ellie's stomach churned. She couldn't shake the image of Henry standing at the cabin door, shotgun in hand, ready to hold off the men who had come for them. She didn't even know if he was still alive. "What happens now?" Ellie asked, clutching her bag tightly. Grant turned to her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "We figure out who we can trust. Someone who can get this drive where it needs to go." Ellie nodded, though the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. The flash drive held the key to stopping her father, but every step toward justice felt like wading deeper into a dangerous game. One wrong move could cost them everything. Grant pulled a map from his bag, spreading it across the small table. He pointed to a city about 2 hours away. "I've got a contact here," he said, "a journalist who used to work with Henry. She's tough, and she's not afraid to go after big targets." If anyone can help us, it's her. Ellie leaned over the map, studying the route. What if they're watching the roads? They probably are, Grant admitted. But we don't have many options. We can't stay here, and we can't keep running blind. Ellie's jaw tightened. Then we go. The sooner we get the drive to her, the better. Grant nodded, folding up the map. We leave in an hour. Pack whatever you need. As they drove toward the city, Ellie couldn't help but glance nervously at every car they passed. Her paranoia grew with every mile, the fear of being followed gnawing at her. Grant seemed tense too, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as he scanned the road ahead. When they reached the outskirts of the city, Grant pulled into a gas station, parking near the back of the lot. "Stay here," he said, handing Ellie a burner phone. "If something happens, call me." Ellie watched him disappear into the store, her heart pounding. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, Grant emerged, carrying 2 bottles of water and a map. "Everything okay?" Ellie asked as he climbed back into the car. "For now," Grant said, handing her a bottle. "But we need to move quickly." They arrived at a small coffee shop downtown, its brick facade blending in with the surrounding buildings. Grant parked a few blocks away, leading Ellie through the bustling streets. The noise and crowds felt overwhelming after the isolation of the past few days, but Ellie tried to focus. Inside the coffee shop, Grant scanned the room before spotting a woman sitting at a corner table. She had dark hair pulled into a ponytail, sharp features, and an air of confidence that made her seem unshakable. She glanced up as they approached, her eyes narrowing. "Grant," she said, her tone both surprised and wary. "Didn't think I'd see you again." "Good to see you too, Leah," Grant replied, pulling out a chair. "This is Ellie. We need your help." Leah's gaze shifted to Ellie, her expression softening slightly. "What's going on?" Ellie hesitated, glancing at Grant. He nodded, encouraging her to speak. Taking a deep breath, Ellie explained everything. Her father's trafficking operation, the flash drive, and the danger they were in. Leah listened intently, her sharp eyes flickering with recognition as Ellie described the files on the drive. "I've heard rumors about a network like this," Leah said when Ellie finished. "But I never had proof. If what you're saying is true, this could be huge." "It is," Grant said. "But we can't go to the cops. Not yet. Too many of them are on Thompson's payroll." Leah nodded, her expression grim. "That doesn't surprise me. But getting this story out won't be easy. Your dad's not just some low-level operator. He's connected to some powerful people, and they'll do everything they can to shut us down." Ellie's stomach twisted. "What do we do?" Leah leaned forward, her voice low. "We'll leak the files to multiple outlets, media, advocacy groups, even international organizations. If we spread it wide enough, they won't be able to bury it." Grant frowned. "And what about Ellie? If her dad finds out she's behind this?" "He'll come after me," Ellie said, her voice steady. "I know, but I can't let him get away with this." Leah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're brave, kid, but you'll need to be careful. Once this goes public, things are going to get messy." They spent the next few hours preparing. Leah transferred the files from the flash drive to her laptop, encrypting them and creating backup copies. Ellie felt a mix of fear and relief as she watched the files upload to secure servers. The evidence was finally out of Richard's reach, but the fight was far from over. As they finished, Leah turned to Ellie. "There's one more thing," she said. "If we're going to do this, we need a statement from you. Your story is just as important as the evidence." Ellie's chest tightened. "A statement?" Leah nodded. "You don't have to go public yet, but if this goes to court, or if the media needs context, they'll need to hear your side of things." Ellie hesitated, her mind racing. She thought about everything she had been through, the lies, the fear, the betrayals. Speaking out felt terrifying, but staying silent felt worse. "I'll do it," she said finally. "Whatever it takes." As night fell, Ellie sat in the back of the car, staring out at the city lights. She felt exhausted, but the weight in her chest had lifted slightly. For the first time, she felt like she was fighting back, like she wasn't powerless anymore. Grant glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You okay?" Ellie nodded. "I think so." He smiled faintly. "You did good today, kid." Ellie managed a small smile in return. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Leah's small apartment, where Ellie, Grant, and Leah had stayed the night. It was a modest space, cluttered with stacks of papers, a few mismatched chairs, and a coffee table covered in empty mugs. Ellie sat cross-legged on the worn couch, her eyes fixed on Leah's laptop. The files from the flash drive had been distributed to trusted media outlets overnight, but the weight of the decision still pressed on her. "What happens now?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leah glanced at her from the desk where she was typing furiously. "Now we wait for the storm." Grant leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression tense. "And brace for whatever your dad's going to throw at us." Ellie nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought. She had no illusions about what Richard was capable of. His threats weren't empty, and she knew he wouldn't back down easily. Hours passed, and the tension in the apartment grew thicker. Leah's phone buzzed constantly with calls and emails from journalists and activists eager to verify the explosive story. Ellie listened quietly as Leah expertly navigated their questions, providing just enough information to ensure the evidence was credible while keeping Ellie's identity out of the spotlight. For now. But Ellie knew it was only a matter of time before her name became part of the story. She had made peace with that. If exposing her father meant justice for the animals he had exploited and the lives he had ruined, it was a price she was willing to pay. By midday, the first article broke. Leah read it aloud to Ellie and Grant, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Illegal wildlife trafficking ring exposed. Ties to prominent figures allege." The story outlined the network Richard was part of, detailing the abuse and exploitation of exotic animals for profit. Ellie's stomach twisted as she heard the descriptions of cramped cages and brutal conditions, knowing that her father had been at the center of it all. "They've got him," Leah said, scrolling through the article. "This is just the beginning. The pressure's going to mount fast." Ellie felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by dread. Her father wouldn't go down without a fight. She turned to Grant, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" "We keep moving," Grant said firmly. "He's going to come looking for us." Leah nodded. "I've got a safe house outside the city. It's not much, but it'll keep you off the grid until this settles." The drive to the safe house was tense and silent. Ellie sat in the back seat, clutching her bag tightly. The city blurred past the windows, replaced by rolling fields and dense forests as they left the urban sprawl behind. The safe house was a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was secluded and unassuming, with a single dirt road leading up to it. Leah parked the car and led them inside, her movements brisk and efficient. "There's food and water," she said, motioning to the small kitchen. "A generator if the power goes out. I'll stay in touch, but don't use your phones." "Not unless it's an emergency." Ellie nodded, her chest tightening as she realized how isolated they were. "How long do we have to stay here?" "Until we know your dad's been dealt with," Leah said, "or until it's safe to move again." The first night at the cabin was restless. Ellie lay awake on the lumpy couch, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past few days replayed in her mind. She thought of Balthazar, Ruby, and Milo, safe at the sanctuary. She thought of Henry, standing alone against her father's men. And she thought of her mother, who had been absent from her life for so long but whose memory still guided her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices outside. Ellie sat up, her heart racing. She glanced at Grant, who was already awake and reaching for the handgun he had taken from Leah's car. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the door. Ellie ignored him, grabbing a flashlight and following close behind. The cold night air bit at her skin as they stepped outside. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under their feet. A shadow moved in the distance, and Grant froze, his eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. The figure stepped closer, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. It was Henry. His clothes were torn and he was limping, but he was alive. "Henry!" Ellie cried, rushing toward him. Henry held up a hand, his face grim. "Not so loud, kid. They're not far behind." Inside the cabin, Henry explained what had happened at the cabin. He had held off Richard's men as long as he could, but they had overwhelmed him. He had managed to escape, but not before overhearing their plan. "They know about the story," Henry said, his voice low. "And they know it leads back to you." Ellie's chest tightened. "What do we do?" Henry glanced at Leah, his expression grave. "We don't wait for them to come to us. We take the fight to them." Grant frowned. "That's suicide." "Not if we play it smart," Henry countered. "They're scrambling right now, trying to cover their tracks. If we hit them hard and fast, we can take them down before they regroup." Leah nodded slowly. "We have the evidence. If we can get it into the hands of someone with authority, someone who isn't on their payroll, we might stand a chance." Ellie felt a surge of determination. "Then let's do it." The next morning, the group set their plan into motion. Leah made contact with a trusted federal agent, arranging a meeting in a neutral location. Henry and Grant prepared for the possibility of an ambush, double-checking their weapons and scouting the area in advance. Ellie tried to steel herself for what was to come. She knew the risks, but she also knew they couldn't turn back now. Her father had hurt too many, and she wouldn't let him continue. As they drove toward the meeting place, Ellie felt a strange sense of calm. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was ready to face it. The drive to the meeting place was tense and quiet. The late morning sun shone through the car windows, but it did little to ease Ellie's anxiety. Grant drove, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of trouble. Henry sat in the passenger seat, his sharp eyes watching the horizon. Ellie and Leah were in the back, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy fog. "Are you sure this agent can be trusted?" Henry asked, breaking the silence. Leah nodded. "Agent McAllister's one of the good ones. He's been after these trafficking networks for years. If anyone can take this evidence and do something with it, it's him." Grant grunted. "Let's hope you're right, because if this goes sideways, we won't get another chance." The meeting place was an abandoned parking lot on the edge of a small industrial town. The cracked asphalt was littered with weeds, and the silence was oppressive. Grant parked the car at the far end, the engine ticking as it cooled. Ellie's stomach churned as they waited. Every sound, a bird in the distance, the rustle of leaves, made her jump. She clutched her bag tightly, the flash drive inside feeling like both a lifeline and a curse. A sleek black car pulled into the lot, its tires crunching against the gravel. Grant and Henry tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. Ellie held her breath as the car came to a stop, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out. "That's McAllister," Leah said, her voice steady but cautious. "Stay calm." Agent McAllister approached with measured steps, his expression serious. He was in his late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and a sharp, analytical gaze. He stopped a few feet away, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't armed. "Leah," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've got something for me?" Leah nodded, stepping forward with the flash drive in hand. "This is everything. Names, transactions, photos, videos. It's enough to bring down the whole network." McAllister took the drive, his expression unreadable. "You're sure about this?" "Positive," Leah said, "but we're running out of time. Richard Thompson and his people know the evidence is out there. They'll do anything to stop us." McAllister frowned, tucking the drive into his jacket pocket. "If this is as explosive as you say, we'll need to move fast. I'll get it to the right people." As McAllister spoke, a sudden noise shattered the tense quiet, the roar of engines. Ellie's heart dropped as several black SUVs barreled into the parking lot, skidding to a stop. The doors flew open, and armed men poured out, their faces set with grim determination. "Get down!" Grant shouted, pulling Ellie behind the car. Henry and McAllister drew their weapons, taking cover as the men opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the asphalt, sending shards of concrete flying. Ellie crouched low, her heart pounding in her chest. "They found us," Leah muttered, her voice tight with fear. "No kidding," Grant shot back, returning fire. "McAllister, you better have a backup plan." "I didn't expect this many of them," McAllister admitted, his jaw tight. "But I've got reinforcements on the way." The gunfight raged on, the air thick with the sound of gunfire and shouts. Ellie pressed herself against the car, her hands trembling. She felt helpless, trapped in the chaos. Henry crawled over to her, his face set with determination. "Ellie, listen to me. If anything happens, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Understand?" Ellie's throat tightened. "But..." "No buts," Henry interrupted. "This evidence is bigger than all of us. You have to make sure it gets to safety." Ellie nodded reluctantly, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't want to leave them, but she knew Henry was right. As the fight dragged on, McAllister's reinforcements finally arrived. A convoy of unmarked vehicles roared into the lot, federal agents pouring out with weapons drawn. The tide of the battle shifted quickly, Richard's men scattering under the onslaught. Ellie peeked over the car, her chest heaving with relief. The agents moved with precision, securing the area and disarming the remaining men. McAllister stepped forward, barking orders to his team. "Secure the suspects," he commanded, "and get this evidence to headquarters immediately." The aftermath was a blur. Ellie stayed close to Grant and Leah as the agents took control of the scene. Richard's men were loaded into vehicles, their grim faces a stark contrast to their earlier confidence. McAllister approached Ellie, his expression softer than before. "You did good, kid," he said. "This wouldn't have been possible without you." Ellie managed a small smile, though her chest still ached with worry. "What about my dad? He's not here." "We'll find him," McAllister assured her. "With this evidence, he won't have anywhere to hide." As the sun set over the parking lot, Ellie felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the evidence was finally in the right hands, fear of what Richard might do next, and a flicker of hope that justice was within reach. She turned to Grant, her voice quiet. "Is it over?" Grant rested a hand on her shoulder, his expression serious but kind. "Not yet, but we're getting closer." The quiet hum of the motel room's air conditioning was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her knees drawn to her chest. The events of the day played in her mind on an endless loop. The gunfire, the roaring engines, the determined look in Henry's eyes when he told her to run. The evidence was safe now, but the fight was far from over. Leah and Henry were discussing next steps at the small table near the window, their voices low and urgent. Grant leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, watching Ellie carefully. He seemed more tired than usual, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. "Ellie," Leah said, drawing her attention, "McAllister's team is moving fast, but your father's still out there. We need to be ready." Ellie nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "What do you need me to do?" Henry gave her a faint smile. "You've done more than enough already, kid. But we need to make sure you're safe." Ellie frowned. "Safe? Do you think he's just going to stop?" "He's not going to give up until he finds me." Grant pushed off the wall, his tone gruff. "She's right. Thompson's not the kind of guy who lets things go." Leah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We'll have to set a trap. Force him to come to us on our terms." The plan came together quickly. Using a fake tip, Leah would lure Richard to an isolated location where McAllister's team could intercept him. The idea made Ellie's stomach churn, but she knew it was the only way to stop him. They couldn't keep running forever. The trap was set for an old industrial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a sprawling, decrepit building, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with graffiti. McAllister's agents were already in position, hidden among the shadows, waiting for Richard to arrive. Ellie and Grant stayed in a nearby car, watching the warehouse from a safe distance. Leah and Henry were inside with McAllister, overseeing the operation. "You okay?" Grant asked, glancing at Ellie. She nodded, though her hands trembled in her lap. I want this to be over. Grant's expression softened. It will be. One way or another. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable. Finally, the low growl of an approaching car broke the silence. Ellie's breath caught as she spotted Richard's black SUV pulling into the lot. He stepped out, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the headlights. Even from a distance, Ellie could see the hard set of his jaw, the cold determination in his eyes. "Stay here," Grant said firmly, opening the car door. "I'll be right back." Ellie grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Be careful." Grant gave her a reassuring nod before slipping into the shadows. Ellie watched as he approached the warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, Richard's voice echoed through the empty space, sharp and commanding. "All right, I'm here. Where's the drive?" Leah stepped forward from her hiding spot, her expression calm but steely. "It's over, Richard. The evidence is already in McAllister's hands. There's no way out of this." Richard's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think I'm scared of some federal agent? You don't know who you're dealing with. You're the one who doesn't get it," Leah shot back. "This isn't just about you anymore. The whole network's coming down." Richard's face darkened, his posture tense. "Where's the kid?" he demanded. "I know she's involved. Tell me where she is." Leah didn't flinch. "She's safe, and you'll never hurt her again." The tension was shattered by the sound of footsteps as McAllister and his team emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. "Richard Thompson," McAllister said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, and numerous other charges. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Richard's gaze flicked between McAllister and Leah, his fists clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might surrender. But then he lunged, grabbing a heavy metal pipe from the ground and swinging it toward Leah. The room erupted into chaos. McAllister's agents moved to intercept Richard, but he fought back with a ferocity born of desperation. Leah ducked out of the way, narrowly avoiding the pipe. Henry tackled Richard from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground. Ellie watched the scene unfold from the car, her body trembling with fear and adrenaline. She couldn't just sit there while her father hurt the people who had helped her. Throwing open the car door, she ran toward the warehouse, ignoring Grant's shouts to stay back. When she burst inside, she saw Richard pinned to the ground by two agents, his face twisted with rage. His eyes met Ellie's, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. "You," he spat, his voice venomous. "You did this to me." Ellie's chest tightened, but she didn't look away. "No," she said firmly. "You did this to yourself." The agents hauled Richard to his feet, cuffing him tightly. McAllister approached Ellie, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said. "But I'm glad you're okay." Ellie nodded, her legs feeling weak. She watched as Richard was led away, his furious shouts echoing through the warehouse. The weight on her chest lifted slightly, though she knew this was just the beginning. There would be court hearings, media scrutiny, and countless questions to answer. But for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. As the night wore on, Ellie sat outside the warehouse, staring up at the stars. Grant joined her, sitting quietly by her side. "It's over," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Grant nodded. "Yeah, it is." Ellie glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you for everything." Grant shrugged, but there was a warmth in his eyes. "You're a tough kid, Ellie. You didn't need much help." Ellie leaned back, her gaze returning to the sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The days after Richard's arrest passed in a blur. The media storm was immediate and relentless, with headlines splashed across every outlet. Wildlife trafficking ring exposed. Prominent figures implicated. Shocking details emerge about Richard Thompson's criminal network. Ellie's name was kept out of the public eye for now, thanks to McAllister and Leah's efforts. Still, she felt the weight of the story pressing down on her. Every article and news clip reminded her of the horrors her father had caused, and the role she had played in stopping him. Ellie sat at Leah's apartment, scrolling through an online news article on Leah's laptop. The words blurred together as her thoughts raced. Richard's trial was fast approaching, and while the evidence was damning, Ellie couldn't shake the fear that he might find a way out. He always had before. "Hey," Leah said softly, breaking Ellie's train of thought. She set a cup of tea on the table in front of her. "You okay?" Ellie shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I keep thinking he's going to get away with it." Leah pulled up a chair, her gaze steady. "He won't. Not this time. You've done more than anyone thought possible. And with the evidence we have, there's no way he can talk his way out of this." Ellie nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. That evening, Grant drove Ellie to the courthouse for a preliminary hearing. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras flashing as Ellie climbed out of the car. She kept her head down, clutching her bag tightly as Grant guided her inside. In the courtroom, Ellie sat beside Leah and McAllister, her heart pounding as the proceedings began. Richard was led in, his hands cuffed, his once imposing figure now diminished. He glanced at Ellie, his cold gaze sending a shiver down her spine. The prosecution laid out their case, presenting the evidence from the flash drive and detailing the extent of Richard's operation. The words were clinical, but the impact was devastating. Ellie felt her chest tighten as she listened to the accounts of cruelty and exploitation. She had known it was bad, but hearing it laid out so plainly was almost too much to bear. During a break in the proceedings, Richard's lawyer approached McAllister, requesting a private meeting. Ellie watched nervously as they stepped into a side room. When McAllister returned, his expression was grim. "He's offering a plea deal," McAllister said, sitting down beside Ellie. Ellie's stomach churned. "What kind of deal?" 15 years in exchange for cooperation, McAllister explained. "He'd give us names, bigger players in the network." Ellie's hands clenched into fists. 15 years? That's not enough for what he's done. "I know," McAllister said, "but it's a chance to take down the rest of the network." Ellie shook her head, anger and frustration bubbling to the surface. "He doesn't deserve a deal. He deserves to pay for everything he's done." Leah placed a comforting hand on Ellie's shoulder. "It's not fair, but if it means stopping more people like him, it might be worth it." Ellie didn't respond, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She wanted justice, but the thought of letting Richard off lightly made her feel sick. That night, Ellie lay awake in Leah's guest room, staring at the ceiling. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You think you're so smart. You don't understand the world. It's about power." For so long, Richard had held all the power in her life. But now, for the first time, she had a voice. She wouldn't let him silence her. Not again. The next day, Ellie made a decision. She approached McAllister before the hearing resumed, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I want to testify," she said. McAllister frowned. "Ellie, you don't have to do this. The evidence speaks for itself." "It's not just about the evidence," Ellie said. "People need to know who he really is, what he's done. Not just to the animals, but to me, to my mom, to everyone." McAllister hesitated, then nodded. "If you're sure, I'll make the arrangements." Ellie's testimony was emotional and raw. She spoke about the years of fear and manipulation, the neglect and cruelty she had endured at her father's hands. She described the night he locked her in the basement with Balthazar, the terror she felt, and the moment she realized she couldn't trust him anymore. The courtroom was silent as Ellie spoke, her voice breaking at times but never faltering. Even Richard's cold demeanor cracked, his eyes narrowing as she laid bare his darkest secrets. When she finished, Ellie felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but also a sense of relief. For the first time, she had taken control of her own story. As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence and Ellie's testimony became impossible to ignore. Richard's offer of a plea deal was rescinded, and the case moved toward a full trial. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Ellie, their questions loud and overwhelming. But Ellie stood tall, flanked by Leah, Grant, and McAllister. "Do you think justice will be served?" one reporter asked. Ellie looked directly into the camera, her voice steady. I think justice is about more than one person. It's about making sure this never happens again. And I'll do everything I can to make sure it doesn't. That evening, back at Leah's apartment, Ellie sat on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. Grant joined her, handing her a cup of hot chocolate. "You did good today, kid," he said, his voice soft. Ellie smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel like it's over yet." "It's not," Grant said, "but you're getting there. One step at a time." Ellie nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had come too far to turn back now. The day of Richard's sentencing was bright and clear, the kind of day that seemed at odds with the gravity of the moment. Ellie sat in the courthouse beside Leah, Grant, and Henry. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths as she waited for the judge to enter. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and members of the public eager to see justice served. But Ellie felt strangely calm. She had faced her father, testified against him, and handed over the evidence that had dismantled his empire. Now, all that was left was to see the final chapter of this story close. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Richard was brought in, his once imposing figure reduced to a shadow of its former self. His face was pale, his movements stiff, but his cold gaze still carried a flicker of defiance as it swept across the room. The proceedings were brief but impactful. The prosecution laid out the charges: wildlife trafficking, conspiracy, corruption, and more, before the judge delivered the sentence. "Richard Thompson," the judge said, his voice firm, "you have been found guilty on all counts. In light of the overwhelming evidence and the harm caused by your actions, I hereby sentence you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Ellie's chest tightened, a mix of relief and sadness washing over her. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the damage Richard had done. After the sentencing, Ellie stepped outside into the warm sunlight. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, but McAllister's team kept them at bay. Grant and Leah stood by her side, their presence steadying her. "What now?" Ellie asked, her voice quiet. Leah smiled softly. "Now you move forward, one step at a time." Over the next few weeks, Ellie worked with Leah and the sanctuary to ensure the rescued animals were safe and cared for. Ruby and Milo had adjusted well to their new home, and Balthazar, though still wary of humans, had begun to thrive under the sanctuary's care. Ellie visited them often, finding comfort in their presence. She felt a deep connection to the animals, survivors of her father's cruelty, just as she was. Each visit reminded her of why she had fought so hard and why she couldn't stop now. Ellie's story became a symbol of resilience and justice. Though her name was eventually made public, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. Activists praised her bravery, and organizations reached out, offering to help her channel her experience into meaningful change. One afternoon, Ellie sat in Leah's apartment, surrounded by papers and notebooks. She was planning her first public statement, a message of hope and a call to action. "You've got this," Leah said, setting a cup of tea on the table. "Just speak from the heart." Ellie nodded, her determination growing. She had spent so long surviving that it felt strange to think about thriving. But now, for the first time, she could see a future filled with possibilities. The day of her statement arrived, and Ellie stood before a small crowd of reporters and activists at the sanctuary. Balthazar lay in the distance, his golden mane gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of the freedom she had fought for. Ellie took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "When I was a little girl, I thought the world was a safe place. I thought people were supposed to protect the innocent. But I learned the hard way that's not always true." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "I also learned that even when the world feels dark, there's always light to be found. And sometimes that light has to come from us. We have to fight for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary." The crowd listened intently, their faces filled with admiration and respect. Ellie felt her confidence grow as she continued. "This isn't just about me or my father. It's about the animals who suffered because of greed and cruelty. It's about the people who looked the other way. And it's about making sure this never happens again. After her speech, Ellie was approached by a woman from a national wildlife organization. She extended a hand, her smile warm and genuine. "Ellie," she said, "your story has inspired so many people. We'd love to have you join us as an advocate. You could make a real difference." Ellie hesitated, the weight of the offer sinking in. She thought about everything she had been through, the people who had stood by her, and the animals who had survived alongside her. Slowly, she nodded. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady. Months passed, and Ellie's life began to take shape in ways she hadn't imagined. She became a voice for change, speaking at events and working with organizations to protect wildlife and expose corruption. She still visited the sanctuary often, finding solace in the quiet strength of the animals she had saved. Grant stayed in her life, his gruff demeanor softening as he became a mentor and friend. Leah continued to guide her, offering wisdom and support as Ellie navigated her new path. And Henry, ever the protector, remained a steadfast presence, his sharp mind always focused on the next battle to fight. One evening, Ellie stood at the edge of the sanctuary, watching the sun set over the rolling hills. Balthazar stood nearby, his golden mane catching the last rays of light. Ellie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had faced the darkness, and though the scars remained, she had emerged stronger. Her journey wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ellie whispered softly, a promise to herself and to the world she was determined to change. "This is just the beginning."